What is going on, guys? Lever actions are all over the place now. It seems like we forgot that they existed for like 100 years and now they're hot again. And I think part of the reason why people are attracted to lever actions is the nostalgia, the Americana, and the history. There's nothing wrong with that. So I thought today's episode would be cool to look at some really cool historic lever action cartridges. Maybe how they relate to newer cartridges, but mostly some historical classic lever action cartridges. So saddle up for this episode of Gunfighter Life, where we talk about guns, gunfighting tactics, some cool old cartridges today. The right way, with Almighty God at the center, Judeo-Christian values, and real-world, first-hand experience. Put in a rapid-fire version of the bio because I'll be honest, I don't have a lot of experience with older, antiquated lever-action cartridges, but it's still cool to talk about. Blessed to have served in the military, law enforcement, combat veteran, private contractor, competition shooter, lifelong hunter, guide. Blessed by God that He got me through all those things so I could share this firsthand training, knowledge, experience with you to serve you today. Let's dive into the podcast. Let's start off with one of the great old Western lever action, which is kind of what you think of, right? When you think about like lever actions, you think of cowboys and John Wayne. And one of the cartridges that was a big part of that was the 4440 Winchester. And I give credit where it's due. I'm going to use a couple of primary sources other than my memory, and that's going to be the Wikipedia pages, and I'll try and do that for both, and also the Hornady reloading manual that I have for both. But the 4440 Winchester, this is from Wikipedia, also known as the 44 Winchester or the 44 WCF. This is me interjecting. A lot of those old Winchester cartridges, probably because it was easier and cheaper to stamp on metal, there will be Winchester centerfire, WCF. Like if you see an old 3030, it probably won't be marked 3030. If it's a Winchester, it'll be marked 30 WCF. And you'll see that like 32 WCF. And in this case, the 44 WCF. Okay, back to Wikipedia. Winchester centerfire and 44 Largo in Spanish-speaking countries was introduced in 1873 by the Winchester Repeating Arms Company. It was the first metallic centerfire cartridge. Interjection again. That's cool. And also that 1873 may ring a bell as far as rifles go. Back to Wikipedia. Manufactured by Winchester and was promoted as the standard chambering for the Winchester Model 1873 rifle as both a rifle and a handgun caliber. The cartridge soon became widely popular, so much so that the Winchester Model 1873 rifle became known as the gun that won the West. Alright, that's the end of that reading from Wikipedia. That's pretty cool, guys. That's a lot of history. That 1873, people that know about it, they kind of like that action. I believe it's a toggle lock action, but pretty cool. Pretty complex, but pretty cool. As far as actions go, it's, I think, kind of known for being smooth and fast firing, especially compared to the things of the day, like the old trapdoors and things like that. This was, again, it's touted as the gun that won the West. Now, whether that is or not, that's a historical debate, but it's known as that. Kind of like the Winchester Model 70 is known as the rifleman's rifle. This is known as the rifle that won the West. Those old 1873s are cool rifles, and this was the iconic caliber they were chambered in. Now, they were chambered in other stuff later, but that's really cool. What about the cartridge itself? Well, it's no slouch. If we look at, and if we're talking about lever actions, this says in Wikipedia, from a 20-inch barrel, a 200 grain bullet at 12.45 for 688 foot-pounds. It's the first load listed. And it lists a 225 grain bullet at 500 foot-pounds. And that's not bad, right? That's no slouch. If we look at modern numbers, it might be a little anemic, but the 9mm classically, I think of the 9mm in round numbers as 115 grain at like 1,200 feet a second. That's pretty vanilla. But in general, you're looking at 350. A hot loaded 9mm is 400. Like a real hot, like a plus P or a plus P plus, a lot of times is hovering around plus or minus that 400 foot-pounds mark, to give you an idea. This is 688 foot-pounds. And that may not seem like a lot for a rifle cartridge, but remember, this, I don't know if it was the first, but one of the first real popular things where you could have your handgun and your long gun chambered in the same caliber, making logistics easier, which I think is often overblown today. I'd rather have the best tool for the job. But when you're talking about the Old West, where, you might have, Bob's Livery and Bob's General Store, and you had what you could get, having just one cartridge kind of made a lot of sense. And it still does to some extent, but if you talk about the OG of that, the original gun for that, one of the original guns is the 4440. A lot of history there. And you can still get new guns chambered in it, right? So if you want a really cool all-around historical cartridge, you're talking about modern centerfire metallic, without having to deal with all the stuff with black powder and all that kind of stuff. That's a really cool one, the 4440. I do believe you can still get a brand new manufactured Winchester model 1873 in 4440. Actually, Winchester lists several on their website of the 1873 Winchester and in 4440. So you could get a brand new Winchester off the rack in 4440. That's pretty cool. And if you talk about a lever action cartridge, again, I think a lot of that is nostalgia and romance and the Wild West and that kind of thing. And if you want that, the 4440 kind of fits the bill. Real quick, we'll look at the reloading manual here. And this lists a 4440, and the only listing it gives is a 205 grain lead bullet at 1,100 feet a second. Just to give you an idea. And the one thing I will say is it's kind of odd. At first glance, it kind of looks like a straight-walled cartridge, but it does have a slight taper. Why that is, I don't know. It seems like it would be easier just to make a straight-walled. But anyway, it's got a very, very slight taper to the case. The next cool little cartridge we're going to talk about is the 3855 Winchester. And it's actually, and I'm going to read a little bit from Wikipedia, actually 3.775 caliber, which is kind of an odd caliber to me, but that's what it is. Also known as the 3855 WCF, which we just talked about, and the 3855 Ballard. It is a centerfire cartridge. It was based on an earlier cartridge called the 3850 Ballard Everlasting that was introduced in 1876 by the Ballard Rifle and Cartridge Company. The 3855 Ballard was originally a black powder cartridge and used in Ballard and Marlin firearms from 1876 onwards for various single-shot target rifles. Their 1893 lever-action rifle was also available in 3855 using a black powder-only barrel. For another barrel designated special smokeless steel capable of safely using the 3855 cartridge loaded with their relatively new and higher pressure smokeless powders. It was later offered by Winchester in its model 1894. Interjection. That might ring a bell. The 1894 is still one of arguably the best lever action carbines ever made. Fantastic, and a lot of copies of it by companies other than Winchester. But in its model 1894, who usurped the name calling it the 3855 Winchester, although it was an exact dimensional copy of the 3855 Ballard. Winchester continued to use the round in various rifles until 1940. That's pretty impressive. So from 1894 to 1940. And also used it in a few commemorative editions of rifles since then. In addition, Marlin offered it in some 336s. That'd be a cool rifle to find. That's my own interjection there. It'd be cool to find one of those. And it was used in non-lever action rifles such as the Remington Lee bolt action. The 3855 Winchester is also the parent case of the 3030 Winchester. I actually didn't know that. I just learned something. And the 32 Winchester Special. and the 357 Winchester cartridge, which we'll get to in a minute. This is me talking here. That's cool. That's a lot of history there. This is one that kind of bridged the gap from black powder to smokeless powder, which tells me if you wanted to, you could load it with black powder. You could load pretty much anything with black powder if you want. You could load a 223 with black powder if you want. But I mean, it would probably work loading it with black powder, and it would probably work if you wanted to load it with a non-corrosive thing like Pyrodex. That's pretty cool. You could get an 1894, which is a great historical rifle, and you could get it in this cartridge. That's really cool. What makes this one really cool well, first let's look at some, we'll get to that later, but let's look at some really cool numbers here. 255 grain bullet at 1320 feet per second for 987 foot-pounds. So this is a smaller caliber. It's got higher sectional density, and the numbers are impressive. That's the first load listed. 255 grains at 1320. This is kind of impressive for the time. For 987 foot-pounds. It lists another load, 255 grain JFN. I assume that's jacketed flat nose, bonded plus P. You're looking at 255 grains at 1950 for 2,153 foot-pounds. That is impressive. That is impressive. That's a beast for an old school lever action rifle. Now, you compare it to like a modern 30-06, it's nothing to write home about, but for the era, that's pretty cool. That's impressive numbers. That'll put some venison on the table. And again, it's the parent case, which I just found out about. I'm not a gun historian. I did not know that was the parent case of the 3030 Winchester, a legendarily awesome deer cartridge. Anyway, a modern version of the cartridge debuted, this is me reading from Wikipedia again. A modern version of the cartridge debuted in 1978 as the 375 Winchester. So now let's go to the wiki page for the 375 Winchester, because I actually like this round. I saw a rifle chambered in it at the gun store the other day when I was kicking around looking at used rifles, and I thought, that's really cool. And I knew about the 375 Winchester, and I was like, I really, really don't need that, but it's really cool. I did not buy it. I'm not a gun collector. But the 375 Winchester is a modernized version of the 3855 Winchester, a black powder cartridge from 1884. It was introduced in 1978 along with the Winchester Model 94 big bore lever action rifle, which was reduced from 1978 to 1986. So basically they took the same cartridge and they just more power. They Tim the Toolman tailored it, to use a reference from my childhood. They just gave it more power. So let's look at some of these numbers. This is from the Wikipedia page. We're looking at a 200 grain bullet at 2,223 feet per second for 2,194 foot-pounds of energy. It lists a 220 grain bullet at 2,236 feet a second for 2,441 foot-pounds of energy. That is impressive. If you're talking about inside, 200 yards, putting meat on the table, that's really cool. If you're looking for kind of a big bore lever action and you don't want a 45-70, you kind of want something else, that 375 Winchester might be the ticket if you can find one. And they're not really coveted, and that's kind of a cool deal. Also, I don't see why, you check this and make sure, but I don't see why you couldn't fire the less powerful older 3855 cartridge if you just wanted to shoot it with a lot less recoil. But that 375 Winchester, that's pretty cool. That's kind of a beast of a cartridge. And also, let's look real quick. First, the 3855 Winchester in the Hornady Reloading Manual lists a 220 grain bullet at 1,700 feet a second. And the 375 Winchester with that same 220 grain bullet at 2,300 feet a second. That's pretty impressive, right? That's impressive numbers. Now, to give you an idea, a much more modern cartridge, and my Hornady Reloading Manual lists rifle data for the 44 Remington Magnum, which is kind of a beast in a rifle. And it lists a 220 grain, which is pretty close to 220 grain. 220 grain, I think. 225 grain at 1750 out of a rifle. And if we look at, again, the 375 Winchester, we're looking at a 220 grain at 2,300 feet a second. That, if the 44 Remington Magnum is a Magnum, that's a Magnum. The 375 Winchester. That's a pretty cool cartridge. I knew about it. I used to know a man that had one. I don't remember him ever killing anything with it, but he sure liked it. He sure thought it was cool, and I think it's cool. Now, again, you're probably not getting a lever action because it's the most practical way to put meat on the table. Probably you like the nostalgia. And that's a pretty cool cartridge, the 375 Winchester. So just some thoughts there. I don't know if you could, since it's the 3855 is the parent case of the it's just me thinking out loud here. Check to make sure you could actually safely do this. But a lot of brass that is made as a Wildcat. Since it's the parent case of the 3030 Winchester, I wonder if you could just use fired brass and neck it up to 375 Winchester, since it's the parent case anyway. Which would mean that the components would be super easy to get if you reload. Anyway, just some thoughts there. That's a pretty cool set of cartridges to talk about, and I thought it was worth talking about. I hear that some of you guys really like the cartridge talks, especially I heard that some of the patrons listen to these with their kids that like to learn about guns and cartridges, and I'm very humbled and blessed by that. I appreciate you guys listening. I really do. If you guys want to support the podcast, consider becoming a patron. There should be a Patreon link in the show notes. Patrons get a lot of cool insider-only content. Support, small American veteran-owned business. Employee numbers 1, this guy. Veteran of U.S. Marine Corps and the Army. And law enforcement. So check all your boxes there if you want to support something like that. Anyway, with that, there should be a Patreon link in the show notes. Your tactical tip of the day. One of the practical things I actually really like about lever-action rifles is they come with iron sights, most of them. Most bolt-action rifles, sadly, don't come with iron sights. I was actually out dry firing today and messing with my Ruger Scout rifle. One of the big reasons I got it, because it has iron sights. It's hard to find rifles with iron sights. But if you want to be a connoisseur of old-school rifle craft, I think that's a skill worth having in shooting with iron sights. Your tactical tip of the day, if you use your iron-sighted rifle a lot, you might rub and wear off the black finish on the sights. A couple of things you can do. What I normally do, because I have one in my pocket as usually part of my EDC, is a Sharpie. I did that today, actually, on a handgun. Rear sight, a little bit shiny. That's not a good thing when you're trying to precisely shoot with iron sights. Hit it with a Sharpie. They actually make a product for this. Back when I was in the Marine Corps, we qualified with the M16A2 out to 500 yards. There was a product called Sight Black. You can buy Sight Black if you want. It's kind of messy. It doesn't last a long time, but if you're going for a match or something, Sight Black is a really matte black spray. It's not like paint. It doesn't really stick on very well, but it works good for what it was intended for a temporary solution. You could use your Sharpie. It's a little bit shiny, but it'll work. You can use Sight Black, or you can get some matte finish black spray paint, spray it in the cap, and take a Q-tip and hit the top of your sights when they start to become shiny. That's your tactical tip of the day. Your tactical verse of the day. You shall not profane my holy name, but I will be hallowed among the children of Israel. I am the Lord who sanctifies you. It's hard today to find any content where the Lord's name is not just taken in vain. It used to be that was a big deal. Now they just toss it about. You shall not take the Lord's name in vain. It's one of the 10 commandments. You shall not take the Lord's name in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. That's commandment number 3. Right? It's a big deal. Just because everybody else does it. You remember that old cliche, just if everybody else is jumping off a bridge? Well, not everybody, but a vast majority of today's society is using the Lord's name in vain. That should disgust you. It should anger you, a righteous anger. Remember, that is a weighty thing, the Lord's name. It is to be hallowed, sacred, holy, set apart, just like you're to be set apart. Thanks for listening, and have a blessed day.